It was the middle of summer, and my parents had left for the weekend to go to our home in Cape Cod. It's about a 2-hour drive away, so it's no big deal for them to leave me at home for a few days. My mom had made some pulled pork and pasta for me to heat up whenever I was hungry, and I had some money if I wanted to order a pizza or something. Things were all good. The first night I was alone. I stayed up until about 3 in the morning playing Xbox, so I woke up really late the next day. I checked my phone when I woke up and saw it was a little past 1 p.m. I'd made plans to play some street hockey with a few friends at 3, so I threw myself out of bed and stumbled into the shower. I take really long showers, so when my parents are gone, I go mental. I was in there for about 45 minutes when I heard my back door open. I immediately froze, since obviously I was supposed to be alone. I waited for about 2 minutes, ears trained in trying to hear anything else. Nothing. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe my parents were home early, so I turned off the shower, wrapped my towel around myself, and slowly walked down the stairs to check it out. The bathroom is directly upstairs from the back door, and the thing is pretty loud when it opens and closes. So the stairs to the kitchen, where the back door is, are pretty tight and walled in, so I can't see into the kitchen when I walk down. Even though my house is old as shit, and each step on the stairs makes a super loud creak, I still took my time and tried to be as quiet as possible. I probably took 45 seconds walking down all of the 12 stairs. When I get to the second to last stair, right before I could see around the corner into the kitchen, I take a little breath to compose myself. In my mind, I knew I was being stupid. There obviously wasn't anyone in the kitchen. There's no way I wouldn't have already heard another noise, and there's no reason for them to still be in the kitchen, even if there were burglars or something in the house. After sort of mentally chastising myself for being such a wuss, I sort of chuckled to myself for being so stupid, and just normally walked the last 2 stairs and turned the corner into the kitchen. Standing about 2 feet away from me, in the middle of the kitchen, is a man staring straight at me, perfectly still, with a massive smile across his face. He's just staring at me. The thing I remember most vividly wasn't his face or his smile, but his arms. They weren't just at his side. He held them in the strangest, most abnormal position I've ever seen. They were where one would normally hold their arms, but he had rotated them to the point where they were almost completely reversed, as well as lifting them up and a little bit behind himself. I don't know why I remember this so much, but it's just the most demonic, abnormal position I have ever seen. Honest to God, I think I almost had a heart attack right there. Looking back, I can realize how fucking creepy this situation was, but in the moment, I just took a step towards him and punched him as hard as I could in the jaw, sort of half slapping, half pushing him towards the ground. The second I connected, I beelined up the stairs, dropping my towel in the kitchen, with my heart beating out of control. I fucking sprinted into my room and locked the door behind me. I quickly put a chair up against the doorknob, like you see in TV. Almost without thinking, I immediately called 911 and, nearly in tears, told the operator what happened. As I sat on the floor of my room, in practically the fetal position, I noticed that the light coming from the gap between my door had stopped. The fucker was standing outside of my door. There's no words to describe the feeling I had. I was paralyzed with fear, watching the shadow across the bottom of my door shift in tiny ways. I stayed balled up, staring at the gap, praying that the man would just go away for what seemed like an hour. All the while, the 911 operator was asking, "Hello, sir. Are you there? Hello." I didn't want to make a noise, and even if I wanted to move my arms to bring the phone up to my mouth, I don't think I could have. Eventually, the light returned to the gap, and I heard the faintest of footsteps slowly creaking the wooden floorboards as he walked down the hall. It was silent for minutes as I just sat there curled up, unable to even speak. Fear does funny things to the body. I heard banging on the front door, and the sound of 2 officers entering my house. I finally felt safe, and I opened up the door to the 2 of them standing there. I almost cried. Nowadays, my parents never leave me home alone. Thank God. And I check every lock on the house before going to bed. I still get nightmares occasionally, and my heart starts racing whenever I see someone standing still, but I'm doing all right. Even working with sketch artists and a few lineups, the police never found whoever the fuck was in my house. That sends shivers down my spine every time I look outside, half expecting to see him standing across the street, smiling under a lamppost. This encounter takes place several years ago, in a remote part of the Australian outback. For a bit of background, I'm a pretty built 6'2" dude, and I was around 26 years old at the time. I was on a road trip with a mate, traveling around the central Queensland outback, in my old semi-reliable Nissan X-Trail. We're both massive science, zoology nerds, and had heard about this amazing dinosaur trail out this way, which is basically a grouping of 3 areas, Winton, Richmond, and Hendon, that have had previous dino bone discoveries, still have fossils, as well as a seriously awesome dinosaur track with preserved foot imprints. We were staying at a place 3 hours from Winton for a couple of days, and were pretty keen to check out this trail, so we made the decision to do the 6-hour round trip in a day. We were pretty ambitious and stupid back then. We left at 9 a.m. the next morning, car packed with lunch, several liters of water, and my trusty GPS, and off we went. It was a long drive, and halfway through, my aircon decided to cark it. If any of you live in or have visited Australia in the summer, you would know that it's brutally hot, so I'm sure you can imagine the 3-hour trip without aircon was hell. To make matters worse, my GPS also stopped working, as the map software didn't recognize the area we were in. Luckily, I had an old Refidex in my back seat, but it was pretty tough to revert back to map reading when you're so used to a computer screen telling you where to go, especially given we're talking about the Australian outback here, complete with dirt tracks for roads and very limited signage. But I digress. Finally, we make it to the trail and kick around there for a couple of hours. Not gonna lie, it was pretty awesome. Then we decided to make the trip back, as it was starting to get later in the afternoon, and we didn't want to drive back in the dark. As we were about to leave, this gnarly old guy who appeared to be an employee of the trail company, dressed in all khaki camouflage gear, asked us about where we were from and where we were heading. He gave me the stink eye when I was vague with details, but my mate told him the name of the town we were staying at. He took a real liking to my mate, and he laughed when he told him about our lengthy journey. Apparently, we had taken the long route, and there was a much quicker way back that would shave about an hour off our trip. We jumped at the directions he gave us, which were all verbal, and we wrote them down. Off we went on our merry way, thinking how lucky we were that we met this old dude who gave us some sweet intel on a shortcut home. But I can't deny, there was a definite creepy vibe coming off him. Based on the directions he gave us, we went winding along several roads in an area I'd never been in, and eventually settled straight back on a narrow dirt road. We were supposed to reach an intersection after about half an hour of driving, take a right, and continue on that road until we got to a main highway that would take us back. After about an hour and a half of driving on this dirt trail, though, we still hadn't reached the intersection. I was starting to freak out a bit, thinking we'd missed the turn, but my mate was completely chilled out and was sure that we'd get there eventually. I think he thought I was driving too slowly, but there are kangaroos out there, and they're dangerous if you hit one. We'd been traveling for quite a while now, and it was getting later and later in the day, and it got to the point where the petrol in the tank was only a quarter full. There were no houses, other roads, or cars in sight, and I was really not comfortable with where this was headed. The middle of nowhere, in a remote area, in the wasteland that is the Australian outback. There weren't any trees, only this dirt road and desolate, dry bushland, as far as the eye can see. I stopped the car and told my mate to get the binoculars out of the vac to take a look around in case there was any landmarks. Yes, I carried binoculars in my car, and I still do. He obliges, and I can just make out a house-like structure not too far in the distance, so we made the decision to head for that. We figured it could be a house, and maybe the people would be nice enough to give us some patrol to top us up, and some better directions to get us out of there. As we neared this structure, it became apparent that this was no house at all. We pulled up out front and see that it's an old caravan that's been burned to a shell from the inside out. It's still got 3 blackened partial walls up though, so we can't see all the way in, and it looks like someone's been there recently, because there are animal bones strung up all over the place, and a cow skull at the entrance of the caravan. Some of the animal bone things even have grass or horsehair woven into them, and they're arranged like decorations. Then we see this hand-painted sign that's been staked into the ground, with the words Moonlight Motel written on it. My alarm bells are ringing loud and clear. I nudge my friend and say, let's get the fuck out of here, but he's distracted by something in the distance. It's a car, coming in the direction we just come from. It must have only been 10 minutes behind us the entire time we were driving, but I didn't see it once. It's kicking up a ton of dust, which indicates that it's coming towards us fast. It's at this point we both hear a creepy scratching sound coming from the burned-out caravan, like someone scratching at the wall from the inside. I move a little closer to try and see what it is, and there is a person in there, peeking out at us from a hole in the damaged wall. Then this childlike voice that's obviously a grown man imitating a little girl giggles and says, "Are you here to play with me?" My mate and I both look at each other, and we book it out of there, back into the inner sanctum of the X Trail. Just as I'm about to reverse out, the other car stops just behind my car with the high beams on. I can't see the driver, but they're in my way, so I can't reverse out of there. I have no choice but to drive forward and turn around that way, narrowly missing the State Motel sign. As we're turning to leave, the driver starts to blare the horn, just hammering it for no reason at all. I just sped off back in the direction that we came, and thankfully the other car doesn't follow. It's getting to twilight at this stage, and pretty dangerous to be out on these country roads once it's dark, because of the aforementioned kangaroo situation, but we're feeling a bit better, as we manage to navigate our way back to where we came from, the Dino Trail, and even start to joke around about what happened. The person in the other car was probably just honking at us to get our attention to help with directions or something. I pull into the parking lot and go to the front desk area of the company that runs the tours. I explained that we had gotten lost on the way back to the town we were staying at, and the lady there was kind enough to give us just enough patrol for the ride back. I couldn't help myself, and I mentioned to her that our workmate was a real jerk for giving us those weird directions. We figured there was no way that we could have messed up with the directions that he gave us. At this point, she gives me a weird look and asked if I could describe him. So I describe him, and her face goes funny. And she says, "That man doesn't work here. I saw him talking with the tourists today, and my boss had to ask him to leave. He kept trying to get the details of where people were staying and telling them that he had vacancies at his place, and they could stay there. The Moonlight Motel." So, to the creepy old dude, who was pretending to give helpful directions to a couple of city folk, to trap and potentially murder them in your lovely accommodation, let's not meet. Me and my family just recently moved to our new house. My dad bought it in an auction. The house was actually better than any of the previous ones we had lived in. It had a big pool in the backside, and a small garden beside the pool too. There was a big tree in the garden which grew scented yellow flowers. The backside is probably the only reason why I agreed to move into the house. The house was also close to my school, hence my parents were happy about the safety measures. Both of my parents traveled a lot, so I got accustomed to staying alone in the house from quite a young age. We had tight securities and alarms all around this new house too. There was no way anyone could break in without setting off the alarm, so I had nothing to worry about. At the back of the house, there stood an old 3-story apartment. I would always see people on the first and second floor, but the third floor felt like no one stayed there. The third story's bedroom windows faced directly at the backside of our house. It was a calm and quiet place, so I kind of liked chilling in my house while my parents were on tour. One weekend, my parents were off to visit my sick aunt in Leh. I stayed back home like usual. It was a Saturday night, and all my friends wanted to hang out at one of my other friends' house. I promised my parents not to stay out late, so after a couple of beers, I came back home. It was 9 p.m., and I wasn't feeling sleepy at all. I went upstairs and got in my bathing suit to go for a swim in the pool. It was a hot summer night. I poured myself a glass of fresh orange juice and put on some music. I swam for some time, and then I drank my juice lying on my pool raft. I must have fallen asleep. I heard a noise, and I woke up. The backside of the apartment was all empty. No one was around. Just then, my eyes went to the third-floor window of the nearby building. A frail old woman was standing in front of the window looking directly at me. Her eyes were so big that her stare kind of freaked me out. I didn't say anything and looked at my watch. It was around 10 p.m. I just continued to lie on my raft, thinking she would leave on her own. After a couple of minutes, when I looked back, she wasn't there on the window. I felt relieved and kept thinking how come I never saw her before. I almost thought that no one lived on the third-floor apartment. That's when I heard my phone ringing. It was inside the house, so I got up out of the pool thinking it was my parents calling. I was just about to step inside when I heard a voice coming from behind me. I froze. It was an old woman's voice. I slowly turned back, and my heart drowned in horror. That old, creepy woman was standing right behind me. There was no way she could have gotten in my backyard without breaking in. Her wide, cold death stare made my legs numb. I literally couldn't walk away, even though I wanted to so badly. I spoke in a broken voice. "Mom, how did you get inside?" She slightly opened her toothless mouth and said, "Isabel, are you still here? Run away now, or your husband will come and bury you there." She then lifted her weak, lean hand and pointed towards the tree in our garden with her long, creepy fingers. My blood turned to ice. I replied in a shaky voice, "What are you saying?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring at the tree, and then back to my face. Her mouth opened, and her eyes widened. It was such a horrible sight. Suddenly, my phone again rang, and I ran towards my room frantically this time. I got inside my room and locked it. It was my dad. I answered the phone and stood sobbing terribly. My dad got all freaked out and called 911 on my behalf. The cops came after 10 minutes, and I told them an old crazy lady from the nearby apartment entered our backyard and said some very bizarre things to me. They immediately went to the apartment building and asked the landlord about his tenants on the third floor. It came out as a shock when the landlord said that that floor of the apartment had been empty for the last 15 years. But he also said that an old lady used to live on that floor way back in the day. She was sick and bedridden, so she spent most of her time sitting near that window inside the dark room, and that her children left her alone during her last days. She even died sitting near that window. The landlord himself did her cremation rituals. The next morning, when my parents came, I told them everything, and a lady cop also stood back with me in the house from last night. She also explained to my parents that I might have just had a bad dream or something, but while they were talking, something popped into my mind. I asked my dad what was the name of the previous owner of our house. He replied, saying the bank told him a woman lived here with her husband in the house before we moved in. But he also added that that was 15 years ago, and he asked why I was asking. My heart started to beat faster. I told the cop that the old woman addressed me as Isabel and said her husband buried her under that tree. They both looked pretty surprised, and the cop even decided to check our backyard. When they dug under the tree, scaring the hell out of everyone, a skeleton of a full-grown woman got discovered from our garden. It had a ring on its left hand. Me, along with my mom, and my dad were all completely paranoid. We never knew that there was a dead body lying in our garden. The cops investigated this matter, and they came to know that indeed it was a woman named Isabel's remains. Her husband filed a missing persons report, But after filing the report, he too left the house and the town. Due to the lack of evidence, the police couldn't find any details about her. Also, no one came to interrogate him about her. Her autopsy report signified that she was murdered by a serious injury made by a blunt object on the back of the head. The cops instantly suspected it was her husband who murdered her and had buried her under that tree. To this day, they are still searching for her husband. I am almost positive that that old lady saw this entire incident from her room's window, but couldn't tell anyone. Even though people find it hard to believe, I think she came back to tell me about it, and I believe it was her ghost that I saw that night. But the question that kept eating my mind was, why me? But this too got answered when the cops published Isabel's picture in the local newspaper, stating about the gruesome case. My parents are still in deep shock. I have no idea what to say. Isabel looks exactly like me, or should I say I look exactly like her. We're still living in the same house to this day, but I haven't seen that old lady ever again.